Why hello there and welcome back to Tabletop Ferox. So, a funny thing happened while I was editing my video on the controversy surrounding the rumors of Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition not using the open game license. The Wizards released a statement about Dungeons & Dragons 6th edition and how it would incorporate the system reference document and open game license. And as you can imagine, that did render quite a bit of the content in the video I was working on more or less unnecessary because there were actually answers to the questions that I was discussing. However, the part of the video where I actually explain the open game license and how it works is just as valid now as it was a few days ago, so here is that part of the video, and then after that part of the video, I will get into the announcement and the things that the Wizards have said about what they will be doing in 6th edition. So I guess if you just want to get to that part, I will put a timestamp on screen somewhere, and then you can just skip ahead to that, but you're gonna miss a very thorough explanation of the open game license. With graphics. So, first off, and hold on, I'm going to blow your mind right here. There is no open game license for 5th edition. Or 3rd edition. And yes, I realize I am being a bit pedantic right here, but if I'm going to discuss this thing, it is important to have and use the correct terminology. So, the open game license is just a set of terms under which content can be used. The OGL itself contains no content. Also, no edition of Dungeons & Dragons has been released under the open game license. Pathfinder has, but that's a whole other thing. What people are generally thinking of when they say OGL content is the 3rd and 5th edition system reference documents, which are basically just cut down no-frills versions of the basic rules from the generally player's handbook and then a lot of the monsters from the monster manual, excluding things that they don't want to make publicly available. Like, for example, in the 3rd and 5th edition system reference documents, they do not include the Beholder, because that is a thing that the Wizards have decided is a valuable core part of their product identity that they do not want to make available via the open game license. The flump is not in either SRD either, but kind of for opposite reasons. So the open game license applied to the system reference document creates a library of content that can be used in other publications, provided they are also published with the open game license. And that might actually seem like a really cool thing for the Wizards to have done, making this large portion of their content available freely to other publishers. And, we could argue about whether it was actually done in good faith or if it was all just some marketing scheme that got out of hand. But for now, let's just focus on what the open game license is, which unfortunately will require me reading and explaining the entire thing, which, it isn't that long, but I am going to be reading an entire legal document. And obvious disclaimer, I am not a lawyer. Nothing I say in this video constitutes legal advice. I am just some weirdo on the internet talking about Dungeons & Dragons. So here is the Open Game License version 1.0a as taken from the SRD 5.1 or the 5th edition SRD, which does also have some additional legal text that I will also be reading. Open Game License version 1.0a. The following text is property of Wizards of the Coast Incorporated and is copyright 2000 Wizards of the Coast Incorporated. Wizards. All rights reserved, and is presented here for educational and critical purposes. Section 1. Definitions. Contributors means the copyright and/or trademark owners who have contributed open game content. So if Publisher A uses the SRD's open game content, Wizards of the Coast is a contributor. And then if Publisher B uses Publisher A's open game content, Publisher A becomes a contributor in addition to Wizards of the Coast. Derivative materials means copyrighted materials including derivative works and translations, including into other computer language, potation, modification, correction, addition, extension, upgrade, improvement, compilation, abridgment, or other form in which an existing work may be recast, transformed, or adapted. Basically, whatever is published using the open game content. So, Publisher A's book, based on the SRD, is derivative material, as is Publisher B's book based on Publisher A's book. Distribute means to reproduce, license, rent, lease, sell, broadcast, public display, transmit, or otherwise distribute. And that one is pretty self-explanatory. I just want to point out that the very important parts are coming up next. Open game content means the game mechanic and includes the methods, procedures, processes, and routines to the extent such content does not embody product identity and is an enhancement over the prior art and any additional content clearly identified as open game content by the contributor, and means any work covered by this license, including translations and derivative works under copyright law, but specifically excludes product identity. Okay, so this is where it starts to get a little tricky. Open game content is the mechanics, provided they do not embody product identity and are an enhancement over the previous open game content. So basically anything you add to the open game content. If you are basing your work on the SRD and you add a spell or a monster or something like that, that would be an enhancement to the existing open game content. So that is your open game content in addition to the open game content you are already using. Product identity means product and product line names, logos and identifying marks including trade dress, artifacts, creatures, characters, stories, storylines, plots, thematic elements, dialogue, incidents, language, artwork, symbols, designs, depictions, likenesses, formats, poses, concepts, themes and graphic, photographic and other visual or audio representations, names and descriptions of characters, spells, enchantments, personalities, teams, personas, likenesses, and special abilities. Places, locations, environments, creatures, equipment, magic or supernatural abilities or effects, logos, symbols, or graphic design, and any other trademark or registered trademark clearly identified as product identity by the owner of the product identity, and which specifically excludes the open game content. So, what does all of that mean? Basically, it means that all of that stuff listed is not open game content. And yes, it is as ambiguous as it sounds, and is also a thing that's going to come up again later, so we are going to get more into it when it comes up later. And these last three are pretty self-explanatory, although notably, the definition of use is a thing we'll be discussing later. Trademark means the logos, names, mark, sign, motto, designs that are used by a contributor to identify itself or its products or the associated products contributed to the open game license by the contributor. Use, used, or using means to use, distribute, copy, edit, format, modify, translate, and otherwise create derivative materials of open game content. You or your means the licensee in terms of this agreement. And now Section 2, the license. This license applies to any open game content that contains a notice indicating that the open game content may only be used under and in terms of this license. You must affix such a notice to any open game content that you use. No terms may be added to or subtracted from this license except as described by the license itself. No other terms or conditions may be applied to any open game content distributed using this license. Basically, this just states that the license applies to the open game content as defined earlier, and that you must identify the open game content as such. Also that you cannot alter the license or add any terms to it, except for where the license says that you can. And basically what that means is that Publisher A cannot add a term to the license saying that Publisher B needs to pay them an additional fee to use their open game content. They are required to use the same license without adding anything to it. Although other content, the product identity that is not open game license, is not beholden to this. So you can have those additional terms in a separate license for a separate type of content. Section 3. Offer and acceptance. By using the open game content, you indicate your acceptance of the terms of this license. And Section 4. Grant and consideration. In consideration for agreeing to this license, the contributors grant you a perpetual worldwide royalty-free non-exclusive license with the exact terms of this license to use the open game content. So basically, if you use the open game content, you are agreeing to this open game license. And if you agree to the open game license, you are granted the rights to use the open game content. Yeah, legal documents can get a little circular like this sometimes. Section 5. Representation of authority to contribute. If you are contributing original material as open game content, you represent that your contributions are your original creation and/or you have sufficient rights to grant the rights conveyed in this license. So you need to have legal rights to whatever it is you are publishing as open game content, either as the creator or because you have acquired the rights from the creator. Essentially, this is just, you are not allowed to publish anything under this license that you have stolen. Section 6. Notice of license copyright. You must update the copyright notice portion of this license to include the exact text of the copyright notice of any open game content you are copying, modifying, or distributing. And you must add the title, the copyright date, and the copyright holder's name to the copyright notice of any original open game content you distribute. So if publisher A uses the SRD, they must include the SRD 5.1 copyright notice. And then in their own work, they must include the copyright holder's name, the title of the book, and the copyright year. Then if publisher B uses publisher A's open game content, they must add that copyright notice to the copyright notice on the open game license. And next up, another very important one, we are returning to product identity. Section 7. Use of product identity. You agree not to use any product identity, including as indication as to compatibility, except as expressly licensed in another independent agreement with the owner of each element of that product identity. You agree not to indicate compatibility or co-adaptability with any trademark or registered trademark in conjunction with a work containing the open game content, except as expressly licensed in another independent agreement with the owner of such trademark or registered trademark. The use of any product identity in open game content does not constitute a challenge to the ownership of that product identity. The owner of the product identity used in open game content shall retain all rights, title, and interest in and to that product identity. Okay, so as established in Section 1D, open game content excludes product identity, and here specifies that that includes indication of compatibility or co-adaptability. That's why you cannot say for Dungeons & Dragons. You have to say something like, compatible with the 5th edition of the world's best-selling fantasy role-playing game. You know the one, wink wink. Although, as indicated here, you can use product identity if you have acquired a separate license for it. And kind of an important note here is that this covers not just the initial Wizards of the Coast product identity. You as a publisher, this protects your product identity as well. So just for an example of the separate license part, the Pathfinder role-playing game compatibility license allows you to use some of the Pathfinder role-playing game's product identity. You can say Pathfinder role-playing game, and they even give you special trade dress to indicate compatibility with your product. You are also allowed under the license to reference Pathfinder role-playing game books by title, which is another thing that would otherwise be considered product identity. Section 8. Identification. If you distribute open game content, you must clearly indicate which portions of the work that you are distributing are open game content. Basically, you must say what is and is not open game content, because remember, the whole point of this thing was that Wizards makes the SRD, and you add to it, and then someone else can add to that, and someone else can add to that, and you create this whole large open game content ecosystem. And if you do not indicate which content in your product is open game content, you do not add to that ecosystem. And there are lots of ways I've seen this done, like different styles of text, different colors of backgrounds, just lists of what is and is not open game content somewhere in the book, or, pulling out all of the main rules and putting them in a separate SRD, like the Wizards did. Section 9. Updating the license. Wizards or its designated agents may publish updated versions of this license. You may use any authorized version of the license to copy, modify, and distribute any open game content originally distributed under any version of the license. And the surprisingly lenient part, because they didn't have to put this clause in here, they could have made this way more restrictive. So the Wizards are allowed to update the open game license, but every previous version of the open game license remains valid. So even if they updated it and made it completely useless, you wouldn't have to use the new version. You could use the old version. Section 10. Copy of this license. You must include a copy of this license with every copy of the open game content you distribute. That one is pretty self-explanatory. And Section 11. Use of contributor credits. You may not market or advertise the open game content using the name of any contributor unless you have written permission from the contributor to do so. Section 12. Inability to comply. If it is impossible for you to comply with any of the terms of this license with respect to some or all of the open game content due to statute, judicial order, or governmental restriction, then you may not use any open game material so affected. And Section 13. Termination. This license will terminate automatically if you fail to comply with all terms herein and fail to cure such breach within 30 days of becoming aware of the breach. All sublicenses shall survive the termination of this license. Basically, you cannot use the license if you are unable to comply with the terms of the license. And if you do violate the terms of the license will be terminated. That is, if they can find you and make you aware of the fact that you have violated the license, because you have 30 days from being made aware to fix the problems or have it terminated. You just gotta stay on the run. And just to reiterate, nothing in this video constitutes legal advice, but especially that last thing. And 14, reformation. If any provision of this license is held to be unenforceable, such provision shall be reformed only to the extent necessary to make it enforceable. And finally, Section 15, copyright notice, which contains the copyright for the open game license itself, and then the copyright notice for the system reference document. So that was a lot to go through, and we're actually still not done yet. We still have to go through the additional legal text from the SRD 5.1. Legal information. Permission to copy, modify, and distribute the files collectively known as the System Reference Document 5.1, SRD 5, is granted solely through the use of the Open Game License version 1.0a. This material is being released using the Open Game License version 1.0a, and you should read and understand the terms of that license before using this material. The text of the Open Game License itself is not open game content. Instructions on using the license are provided within the license itself. The following items are designated product identity as defined in Section 1E of the Open Game License version 1.0a and are subject to the conditions set forth in Section 7 of the OGL and are not open game content. Dungeons & Dragons, D&D, Player's Handbook, Dungeon Master, Monster Manual, D20 System, Wizards of the Coast, D20 when used as a trademark, Forgotten Realms, Faerun, proper names including those used in the names of spells or items, places, Underdark, Red Wizard of Thay, the City of Union, and there's just a very big list of D&D place names here, which I don't feel like reading, so I'm just going to skip ahead to Lady of Pain, Book of Exalted Deeds, Book of Vile Darkness, Beholder, Gauth, Carrion Crawler, Tanari, Ba-Tezu, Displacer Beast, Githyanki, Githzerai, Mind Flayer, Illithid, Umber Hulk, Yuan-Ti. All of the rest of the SRD5 is open game content as described in Section 1D of this license. Alright, so now with all of that out of the way, the big question here is, what rights does the Open Game License applied to the System Reference Document 5 actually grant you? And to answer that question, we must first examine the three kinds of stuff that we are dealing with. First, we have product identity, the stuff that is 100% not open game content. Although what actually is product identity is a little unclear. The list provided in the legal text for the SRD just included trademarks like Dungeons & Dragons, Dungeon Master, Player's Handbook, D20, etc., as well as proper names of people, places, organizations, and a handful of monsters. Like, a weird handful of monsters. As opposed to the Section 1E description, which, just as a reminder, includes names and descriptions of characters, spells, enchantments, personalities, teams, personas, likenesses, and special abilities, as well as thematic elements, which I can pretty much guarantee does not have a legal definition. So while the spell title Mordenkainen's Faithful Hound is definitely product identity because it has the name Mordenkainen in it, the version of the spell in the SRD simply titled Faithful Hound is probably open game content, unless the spell title and description are considered product identity based on the Section 1E description. Second, we have the abstract open game content, the stuff that is 100% definitely open game content. So like the idea that a cleric starting at 8th level can once per round add a d8 radiant damage to their weapon attacks. That is open game content. Basically, this is the category that includes, just the conceptual ideas of the rules. All of the stuff that can't actually be copyrighted. If you weren't aware, game rules cannot be copyrighted, which is actually a good thing, because if they could, Wizards of the Coast would probably be claiming ownership of the entire concept of a role-playing game. Because remember, they did argue that they owned a trademark on the word kaiju. And the third type of content is the written open game content, which may or may not be functionally open game content. Basically, the actual text of the rules, which explains the things that are definitely open game content, but itself is protected by copyright. So just back to Divine Strike, the concept of the ability, as I explained it, is not protected by copyright, but the text in the book, or the SRD, explaining that ability is. And I guess the main question here is, do the methods, procedures, processes, and routines of the mechanics extend to the text explaining them? And I cannot answer that question. I do not have anywhere close to the expertise required to do so. But just in general, I would not advocate copying anything more than a few words from a source without a license specifically stating that you can do so. However, for this discussion to actually progress beyond this point, I do kind of need to answer that question. So, for the purposes of this discussion, I am just going to assume that the legal text on the SRD is the authority. So we'll be assuming that only the things listed there are to be considered product identity, and that everything else, including the text, is open game content. But even with that very liberal interpretation, we do need to keep in mind that it is still exclusively the material in the SRD that is the open game content. So, just for example, names like Mordenkainen, Bigby, and Tensor have been removed from the spells, but some other proper names still remain in the SRD, like the names of deities in the cleric's life domain. Also notable, the life domain is the only cleric domain that is included or even referenced in the SRD. So while the life domain and Divine Strike are open game content, the knowledge domain and potent spellcasting are not. Now, could you just make up your own ability for a cleric domain that happened to have the exact same effect as potent spellcasting? Yes, you could, but that is a topic for a bit later. So basically, under the open game license, you cannot have an NPC who is a cleric of Vecna with the knowledge domain, and arguably you couldn't even have an NPC that was a cleric with the knowledge domain. You certainly couldn't list the abilities from the knowledge domain, and maybe you couldn't even reference it. It's not entirely clear. Anyway, back to the main question. What can you do with the open game content? And of course, I think the best example here of using the open game content is Pathfinder. They essentially took the entire 3.5 SRD and built a game on top of it, using pretty much the entirety of that open game content. And that is actually why every single Pathfinder First Edition book is released under the open game license. They are all considered to be open game content, which are derivatives of the 3rd edition system reference document. So, does that mean that you could just do a Pathfinder and make your own version of 5th edition based on the 5th edition system reference document? Yes and no. Like, you could do it. However, there is a bit of a difference in that there is a much larger portion of 5th edition content excluded from the SRD than there was in 3rd edition. So, for example, a lot of the class features where you get to choose from a list of things only include one of those things in the SRD. So you would have to make up the majority of your own cleric domains, martial archetypes, monastic traditions, etc. As mentioned earlier, it does not include the knowledge domain, and it does not include potent spellcasting. But you know what? Even though you could do that, chances are you're not going to. I realize a lot of people are saying that they're going to, but they're probably not. So let's focus on something a bit more realistic and say that you are publishing an adventure for, well, not for Dungeons and Dragons, as, is required for you to not say by the terms of the open game license, but, an adventure that might coincidentally happen to be compatible with Dungeons and Dragons. How much of the SRD are you really going to be using? I mean, are you going to be using the basic rules, the descriptions of skills and feats and classes and spells and magic items? Specifically, are you going to use them in the sense of distribute, copy, edit, format, modify, translate, or otherwise create derivative materials as defined in the open game license? And the answer there is probably not, and if you do, it's likely to only be like a handful of items. The most likely piece of open game content you are likely to actually use is going to be monster stats, because ironically, you can reprint the stats for a skeleton in your product, but you cannot say, see the monster manual page 272 for skeleton stats, because monster manual is product identity, so you cannot reference it. Of course, you can also say the door is guarded by 2 skeletons, and anyone who is actually going to be using a third-party adventure is probably going to be at least familiar enough with the game to have a general idea where they might need to look to find skeletons. Basically what I'm getting at here is if you are using, specifically as defined in the open game license, any of the open game content, you have to use the open game license. But if you are not using, as defined in the open game license, any of that content, you don't actually have to use the open game license. But does that mean that you shouldn't use the open game license in a situation where you do not absolutely have to? And honestly, that's up to you. The only actual downside to the open game license is if you don't want other people to be able to use your open game content in their open game content. But you can literally just specify that the content you don't want people to use is not open game content, and that just kind of, settles that whole thing. Personally, I'd say that as long as it's not causing more problems than it's worth, you might as well use the open game license because OGL or no GL, you can't say compatible with Dungeons & Dragons, but you might be able to say compliant with the open game license. See, it says it right here on the Book of Erotic Fantasy. So, now that I have given you something approximating a vague understanding of the open game license as applied to the system reference document, we can get into the topic at hand. The future of the open game license as it applies to 6th edition 1D&D Dragon.app whatever. Which I guess we have more information on now, so let's see what the Wizards have to say in their post on OGLs, SRDs, and 1D&D. So I guess the most important part is they have announced that there will be an SRD for 6th edition, licensed under an open game license. Also, additional little disclaimer here, as an internet commentary person, it is my job to look at what the Wizards are saying and trying to figure out what that could mean and what they could be doing. And I am very much going to be pointing out the worst possible scenarios here, not the most likely ones. I am just working off of the limited amount of information they have given me, which is not complete or final information in regards to what they are actually going to do, and is actually kind of intentionally vague. First, they are still making a really big deal about reassuring everyone that it's going to be completely backwards compatible with 5th edition, but as I say every time they try to reassure everyone that it's going to be completely backwards compatible with 5th edition, D&D Next was supposed to be backwards compatible with every previous edition of Dungeons & Dragons. And that didn't happen, did it? And now the big, not great announcement, they will be using a version 1.1 of the open game license, which is going to be much more restrictive than the version that we have now. Which is something that they've really wanted to do since at least 2008, but I guess they didn't have the creepy level of brand loyalty or e-celebrity endorsements necessary to be confident that they could get away with it. In fact, when they tried to replace the open game license in 2008, they very much didn't get away with it. That's why they brought it back for 5th edition. But, you know, they do have very good reasons here. In their own words, the OGL needs an update to ensure that it keeps doing what it was intended to do. Allow the D&D community's independent creators to build and play and grow the game we all love, without allowing things like third parties to mint D&D NFTs and large businesses to exploit our intellectual property. So, a little bit of advice here. Complaining about being exploited by large businesses when you are literally the largest and most exploitative business in the entire industry is not a great look. Also, the weird reference to NFTs, I know there was a D&D NFT thing, but it also kind of feels like they just went and said, what is universally reviled on Twitter and will get people on our sides? NFTs, yes, we're trying to stop the bad NFT people. And also note the very specific language of third parties from minting D&D NFTs, because they still want to mint them themselves. Anyway, as for the actual changes to the license, or at least the ones they have mentioned, they are now stating that the OGL will specify that it only applies to print media and static electronic files, which they say is to clarify that it doesn't apply to D&D merchandise like minis and novels, which makes very little sense given that, as outlined previously, open game content only applies to mechanics, and in general, the rules of the game don't really tend to show up in minis and novels. In fact, the only things that the Wizards would really have any legal claim against showing up in D&D merchandise are their trademarks, so D&D and Dungeon Master, and all of the stuff that is already excluded from the open game license in version 1.0a. But, you know, enough about what this doesn't affect. Let's get into what it specifically disallows, and that is the licensing of content used in virtual tabletops. I mean, unless that content is only provided in a static electronic file like a PDF or an EPUB, not like rules modules which are then integrated into a larger experience. You know, like you do on a virtual tabletop. And while I cannot think of any others off the top of my head right now, I am very confident that there are multiple other types of non-static electronic files that people are using right now to distribute their content, which I guess they won't be allowed to anymore. There is also specific mention of videos, which may be nothing or it may be something, because the idea of watching a group of people playing D&D being a multi-million-dollar media empire was a thing that just did not exist when they made the first open game license. Although apparently that currently is and will continue being covered under the fan content policy, which I did not know was a thing until right now, I am absolutely horrified by, and is probably what we should be looking at to get an idea about what kind of agreement a modern Wizards of the Coast is likely to come up with. But now the part that I assume people are the most upset about, because it is the worst part. The open game license will now have two different sets of terms, one for share-alike content and one for commercial content, with the commercial use now requiring an unspecified agreement to the terms, and also, let us know what you're offering for sale. So, does this mean that every third-party publisher who wants to produce commercial products will now need to register with Wizards of the Coast LLC? Alright, so I missed this initially, but they are saying there's going to be a web portal for registration, which is a pretty strong indicator that you will have to register. And more importantly, are you going to need to be approved for the license? Is that why they want you to let us know what you're offering for sale? And if all of the publishers have to be registered with Wizards of the Coast, does that mean that they can then revoke a publisher's license if they do something that the Wizards don't like? It really feels like let us know what you're offering for sale is trying really hard to be both informal and intentionally vague so that you can't really be sure what it means. Which is kind of bad when it could hypothetically be the most restrictive part of the license. Publishers will now also have to report open game license related earnings that are $50,000 or more a year, and honestly that's kind of fair. Same with requiring royalties from publishers making in excess of $750,000 a year. Like, when you're making that kind of money, I kind of feel like you can be held to different terms, and that is my general thing here is I would be a lot less uncomfortable with this if it was a separate set of terms for people who are making certain amounts of income off the open game content. Because as it is now, it feels like they are retooling the entire open game license to crack down on the top 0.1% of publishers and just fucking everyone else over in the process. Because, you know, they're Wizards of the Coast, and what are you going to do about it? Are you going to stop playing D&D? That's ridiculous. There's no such thing as other games. And finally, the really weird one, you will be required to put a creator product badge on all of your OGL works, which feels much less like a cool OGL compatibility badge and more like a warning, this is not a real D&D product badge. Which does kind of seem like them acknowledging that when they first made the OGL, it was done under the impression that third-party publishers would never equal or exceed their level of quality. And now that they have, I guess the Wizards have decided that it isn't enough to just not allow the third-party publishers to identify compatibility with Dungeons & Dragons. Now they need to have a special logo to identify them as a second-rate product, which I'm sure is the goal. They want you to see the creator product badge and go, oh, well, that's probably just some amateur junk. I'm gonna buy a real D&D book. And those are the only changes that they have announced so far. As I've said, the language is kind of intentionally vague and more than a little condescending. This very much feels more like a quick damage control post than it does a big official announcement. Although, you know, you would think that Wizards of the Coast would be a bit better at damage control posts by now, because, you know, they've been doing a lot of them lately. But it is kind of looking like we might want to assume that the worst case scenario might be the best case scenario. Overall, it does look kind of bad, But I do have some very important questions. If Section 9 of the Open Game License states that you may use any authorized version of this license to copy, modify, and distribute any open game content originally distributed under any version of this license, wouldn't that mean that version 1.0a not only remains valid, but also that it can be used to license content released under the 1.1 license? Unless they can somehow deauthorize the previous version, it seems like any version would mean any version. So maybe they're going to add the new terms to the SRD, which would make more sense as these new terms only seem to apply to the Wizards content. Like, I'm pretty sure that if I release something under the new Open Game license, I would not be able to demand that anyone who wanted to use my Open Game content would need to put an additional demeaning little badge on their product. Except that I don't think they can do that, as Section 2 states, no other terms or conditions may be applied to any open game content distributed using this license. So, unless they are going to extend what is covered by the Open Game license and then have these new terms cover that additional content, a lot of what's here feels more like language that is trying to imply that they have much wider reaching authority than they actually do. Like how they're bringing up that minis and novels are not covered by the Open Game license, which is something that not only were they never covered, but there's not even any way that they would be covered. And it kind of seems like they're trying to create the impression that their intellectual property extends to basic fantasy concepts like elves and dwarves, or clerics and bards, or Dungeons and Dragons. Stuff that, they do not and cannot own. Note, they cannot own Dungeons and Dragons separately. They can own the phrase Dungeons and Dragons as a trademark for selling tabletop role-playing games, and video games and movies and anything else that they have branded with Dungeons and Dragons. It's a lifestyle brand now, And it just kind of feels like they are working under the idea that if they act like they have the authority, then people will just assume that they do, when in reality most of their intellectual property is built upon ideas that are third-hand at best and they do not have ownership of. As evidenced by the fact that TSR, who, Wizards of the Coast bought to acquire Dungeons & Dragons, had to change the hobbits in their first edition to halflings because they just lifted most of that from Lord of the Rings. Of course, it might turn out that none of this actually matters, as they try and shift focus entirely to a microtransaction-fueled app-based experience via D&D Beyond and their new upcoming virtual tabletop. I mean, as I pointed out earlier, the new terms do specifically target any kind of interactive electronic content distribution platform, also known as competitors to D&D Beyond. And also, unless they put in some kind of exception for D&D Beyond, this pretty much means that they have no intention to allow access to that platform via the Open Game license. And I'm not saying that they just won't allow third-party content on D&D Beyond, just that we should probably be looking at the more exploitative terms of the DM's Guild as a model for how they would eventually do that. Except, worse because on a platform that they have total control of. Now, earlier I suggested that there wasn't really any reason to not use the Open Game license, even if your content didn't technically require it. But now it does kind of seem like they are specifically providing you with several reasons to just stick with version 1.0a or, no GL at all, and just avoid any Open Game content in your works. Which, is a thing that people managed to do for like 20 some odd years before the Open Game license existed. Third-party D&D books didn't just, appear overnight in the year 2000. Although either way, we can probably count out support for third-party publishers from other virtual tabletops, because either you won't be able to put the content on the virtual tabletop by the new terms of the OGL 1.1, and they could also just refuse to incorporate any content that's from the 1.0 license or just unlicensed D&D content, because that might make Wizards of the Coast a little mad at them, and they might lose their access to official Dungeons & Dragons content. No platform is going to risk losing access to official Dungeons & Dragons content for third-party publishers. So basically, I guess you can either adopt the new OGL, or, be f***ing punk rock and go without. Either way, it is definitely going to get more difficult to publish third-party content for Dungeons & Dragons, either under the new, more restrictive rules or, just outside of them. But as I said, this is just a very early draft of whatever they're doing. Maybe it won't be that bad. Or, maybe it'll be much worse. Either way, I'm just glad to see that Wizards of the Coast are finally stepping up to the task of creating a worse user experience than 4th edition. And thank you for watching, with extra special thanks to my Fight and Flail Snails, Samuel Gorski, Ranty Mulholland, and Toshirokuro. If you'd like to be cool like them, you can check out my Patreon, where you can get early access to videos and fun stuff that I make for the Patreon. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, these other videos which either myself or the Cold Heartless YouTube algorithm have lovingly selected for you, which I'm sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.